Who were the Seljuks? What is a sultan, a vizier, and the ulama, singular alim? Describe the life of al-Ghazali. What is the Nizamiya? Describe some of the arguments of al-Ghazali and some of his major works. What is occasionalism? If you remember our discussions of Kalam, the ISUIIs concluded that human reason could never contradict the words of the Quran. While it certainly happened that from time to time, human reason and the sciences seemed to disagree with the Quran, that wasn't a shortcoming of the Quran, it was a shortcoming of the human mind. The God of the Quran clearly says that it speaks and sees. And while reason can rightfully conclude that God doesn't have a mouth or eyes the way that we do, reason can't conclude that God doesn't have a mouth or eyes at all. ISUII theology says that God does have these things, but bila kaif. We just don't know how God has these things. We can't know. When it comes to God, the ISUIIs say that human reason has hit a brick wall. And then we have Falsafa, the Islamic philosophers and scientists. They give much more credit to the Aql, human reason, than the theologians do. The philosophers are certain that not only must reason and revelation agree with each other completely, but that reason by its very nature is the human faculty to understand how God works. To say that people are rational animals is just another way of saying that people are the animals with the ability to deduce the ways of God. And so if revelation and reason don't appear to agree, that's a problem that needs to be resolved. If the Quran says that God has hands or implies that God has eyes, well, that makes no rational sense, and so we have to take it metaphorically. So now we have an impasse in medieval Islamic thought. Kalam or Falsafa? Do we trust revelation over reason or reason over revelation? The most impactful medieval response to this concern came from the monumental figure of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. If you were to make a short list of the 10 most important intellectuals who ever lived, Ghazali would certainly make the cut, and would probably be towards the top of the list. His impact on Islamic thought is massive, to say the least. And even beyond the Islamic world, his contributions to logic, and most especially his demonstrations of causality, would affect Jewish and Christian thought as well. If you ever studied Roman Catholic theology, for instance, Ghazali is that guy that all the theologians call Al-Ghazal. To understand Ghazali, we need to understand the world he lived in. Ghazali lived during the heights of the Islamic Middle Ages under the Abbasid caliphs, specifically during the Seljuk period of Abbasid rule. In the year 1037, 2 decades before Ghazali was born, a new tribal people came out of the Aral Sea region who spoke the Aguz languages, the forerunners of modern Turkish. The ruling family of these people were called the Seljuks, after their ancestor of that name. These Seljuks led their tribes southward into the Islamic world and westward into the Roman Byzantine Empire. In 1055, the Seljuk leader Tughril Bey struck a deal with the Abbasid Caliph down in Baghdad. The Seljuks would support the Abbasids against the Byzantines and their other enemies, and in turn, the Seljuks themselves would absorb many of the political powers of the Abbasid Caliph himself. So in short, the Abbasids were still the caliphs in Baghdad, but A massive portion of their political might was now held by the Seljuk dynasty. The Seljuks became the sultans, literally the ones who have power. The caliph would remain as the symbolic leader of the realm, the commander of the faithful, for those Muslims who saw him as the steward of Prophet Muhammad on earth. But the military and governmental power of the empire was now going to be held by the Seljuk sultans. And it turns out that the Seljuk sultans were rather good administrators of the empire. Remember that they, like the pre-Islamic Arabs centuries before, were a tribal people, and tribal people are notoriously practical. They're used to living rough. So when it comes to running a government, they find the best people for the job, regardless of their status, background, or ancestry. The most notable example of this was Abu Ali Hassan ibn Ali Tusi, who was appointed to be the Seljuks' vizier, from wasir, basically meaning their prime minister. Although he was of low birth, he proved so good at his job that he was renamed Nizam al-Mulk, Persian for the Order of the Kingdom. Nizam al-Mulk strengthened relations between the various ruling elites of the Abbasid and Seljuk dynasties, crushed a number of rebellions, and most especially established a university system across the Abbasid world, which was in time named after him, the Nizamiya. The Nizamiya schools were the world's first state system of higher education. There was a central campus in Baghdad, the Abbasid capital, and then there were satellite campuses in other cities across the empire. And all these schools were open to people from different economic and ethnic groups. But the key bit here was the curriculum. All the campuses taught Islamic sciences like fiqh, as well as falsafa, Arabic, mathematics, history, music, and literature. But they were being taught following a universal standard of education. Everyone at all the campuses were reading the same books in the same order. It was a standardized educational system. Before the Nizamiya universities, if you had advanced education anywhere in the world, you read whatever books you had access to. If you were lucky and rich, you would have a decent library and maybe a professor to tell you which books are the most important ones to read and in which order to read them. But the Nizamiya streamlined this process by making sure that everyone had access to the most important books in their respective fields. You didn't need to travel hundreds of miles to find some book that someone said was significant. If the book was significant, the local Nizamiya already had it. And so if you're building a whole new university system, what you need are educators. These are the ulama, singular alim, the knowers, the ones who know things. These are the scholars of the Quran, the Sunnah, falsafa, fiqh, and kalam. And this is where Al-Ghazali comes into our story. He is an alim, one of these ulama. Now, he was born in Tus, modern Mashhad in Iran. And Nizam al-Mulk was looking for the best teachers of this new university system. And so, he hired Al-Ghazali to run the Nizamiya school in the Seljuk capital in the city of Isfahan. We know quite a bit about Al-Ghazali. Fortunately for us, Ghazali later in life wrote a kind of spiritual autobiography where he explained how he studied, the different kinds of worldviews he learned about, and the problems of education that he encountered. This is the Al-Munqidh min ad-Dalal, the Deliverance from Error, which Ghazali wrote around the year 1100. It's a rather unusual book. Usually, when an intellectual tries to write about some abstract matters like philosophy or theology, they try to remove themselves personally from their thoughts. But Ghazali does the opposite. The events of his life are interlocked with his intellectual and spiritual development, and so he weaves the story of himself and his search for truth together into a seamless whole. As a young man, Ghazali considered all the many beliefs and opinions that he knew about, and he wondered how they could all fit together. The diversity in beliefs and religions, and the variety of doctrines and sects which divide men, are like a deep ocean strewn with shipwrecks, from which very few escape safe and sound. Each sect, it is true, believes itself in possession of the truth and of salvation. From the period of adolescence, that is to say, previous to my reaching my 20th year, to the present time, when I've now passed my 50th, I have ventured into this vast ocean. I have fearlessly sounded its depths, and like a resolute diver, I have penetrated its darkness and dared its dangers and abysses. I have interrogated the beliefs of each sect and scrutinized the mysteries of each doctrine in order to disentangle the truth from error and orthodoxy from heresy. He starts with Falsafa, the material sciences. These are grounded in Burhan, demonstrability by observation and experiment. That is, what the five senses show to us that appears to be true and reliable information. And yet, Ghazali also notes that everyone is also aware that the senses can be fooled. For instance, he says, you can look at a star in the sky, and while it looks no bigger than a speck of gold dust, you know that your eyes are tricking you. The eye can see a star and believe that it is the size of a piece of gold. But mathematical calculations prove, on the contrary, that it's larger than the earth. These notions, and all others which the senses declare true, are subsequently contradicted and convicted of falsity and indisputability by the judgment of reason. Well then, Ghazali says, how about those intellectual suppositions that one arrives at by reasoning? Are those any more reliable? Think of ideas like 10 is more than 3, or a positive amount cannot be a negative amount, or two contradictory powers cannot coexist at the same time and place. Are these reliable? To this argument, I remained some time without a reply. A reflection, drawn from a phenomena asleep, deepened my doubt. Do you not see, I reflected, that while asleep you assume your dreams to be indisputably real? Once awake, you recognize them for what they are, baseless fantasies. Who can assure you then of the reliability of notions which, when awake, you derive from the senses and from reason? So when you're asleep and dreaming, everything seems so real. You don't even think that the thoughts that you're having are irrational, strange, or impossible. You're so sure. But then you wake up, and everything seems so obviously ridiculous. So then is it possible to hold a thought, be absolutely certain that it's rational, and be wrong? Well, yeah, we do this all the time. So how can anyone ever really know anything for sure? Now, at this point in his life, Ghazali has been appointed to be one of the ulama who runs the Nizamiya in Isfahan. And he does his job very well, gathering over 300 students. Then, Nizam al-Mulk promotes him to the central campus of the Nizamiya in Baghdad, where he is the professor of Shafi'i fiqh. So he's one of the most influential people in the empire. People look to him for his fatwas, his opinions, and he's getting paid very well to teach his thought. But then, his questions over the reliability of knowledge start to creep into his public life. Ghazali's doubts about sensory information and the soundness of rational conclusions were giving him some kind of emotional impairment. Today we'd probably call this severe anxiety or clinical depression. He just couldn't shake this feeling that he, one of the smartest people in the world, a professor at the most prestigious university that had ever been, perhaps didn't know anything at all. Could he be sure? Taqlid isn't known for sure, and Burhan isn't known for sure. So Ghazali considered all of the learned people of the ulama around him and those he had read, and he concluded at the end there's only three kinds of people who claim to have knowledge. First, there were the theologians, the ones who practiced kalam. Now, kalam was designed to separate correct opinions about God, orthodoxy, from incorrect opinions, heresy. And its primary function was to verify Islam, the Quran, and the Sunnah of the Prophet. And while Ghazali is himself a theologian, and he agrees that kalam is good at finding and defending orthodoxy, it doesn't really provide certainty. Kalam assumes from the beginning that the opinions one already holds about God are correct, and then it tries to verify them. So theologians load their own arguments. Islam, as I understand it, must be true, and so how can I prove that what I already think is true? And then, even if the theologian happens to be right, they really don't understand why they're right. The second class of people who claim to know things are the philosophers. The people who claim that the only truth they presuppose is logic, reason. But that's just like the theologians. The philosophers start with a belief and then set out to prove it correct. They assume that the world works as they understand it to work, and then ignore anything that contradicts their understanding. So a mathematician does math, and is amazed at how logical and consistent it is. But then, they convince themselves that what they practice in other sciences has the same degree of rationality that their mathematics has. And logicians do this too. Just because they think about and know about logic, that doesn't mean that everything that they think and do is logical. And again, Ghazali is not anti-philosophy. He is a philosopher, and an accomplished one at that. To explain his points about kalam and falsafa, Ghazali offers the comparison of a beggar who sees someone make counterfeit coins. The counterfeiter pulls some coins out of his purse to give them to the beggar. Now, if the beggar refuses to take them all together, he may miss out on something of value. If he takes all the coins and doesn't question the real worth of each coin, he may be tricked. So rather than just condemning all the coins from the counterfeiter's purse as bad, the beggar needs to take them all on, case by case, and study each individually. And so, like with kalam or falsafa, one should seriously study both, but never just accept both of them wholesale. You have to slowly separate the gold from the junk. Finally, Ghazali considers the mystics, that is, people who've had personal experiences of God for themselves. They also claim to know things for sure, just like the theologians and the philosophers. Ghazali studied their books, but unlike the theologians and the philosophers, the mystics have practices. You don't just have to make an argument about something, you have to have an experience of it for yourself. It's like the difference between knowing what is healthy for your body and actually being healthy. To define health and satisfaction, to grasp their causes and conditions, is quite another thing from being well and satisfied. To define drunkenness is to know that it's caused by vapors which rise from the stomach and cloud the seat of intelligence, and that is quite a different thing to being drunk. Ghazali thought about the mystics further. He realized that the only way to see if they had found true and certain knowledge would be to actually experience what they experienced. He couldn't just read about it in books, he actually had to do something. He had to become a mystic himself. At the same time, Ghazali found himself caring less and less about kalam and philosophy, which were literally his occupation. Everything he had studied and mastered before seemed of no consequence. He had never experienced these things on his own, so he felt that he knew nothing. His depression worsened. he realized that the only reason he studied to begin with was because he was trying to impress others and feel smart and important. He had no right to teach anyone about God, Islam, or knowledge. He was just some selfish fool. So something had to give. And in the end, Ghazali vowed to give up his life of luxury and fame, leave Baghdad, and set out into the unknown to live as a mystic. Ghazali rightfully considered this a radical step. Should he give up everything he knows and try to find certain knowledge of things, or should he stay in Baghdad lecturing and making lots of money? His depression just got worse and worse. Eventually, after 6 months after first considering being a mystic, Ghazali lost the ability to speak. He couldn't talk, and so he couldn't teach. His stomach started hurting him all the time. He couldn't eat, he couldn't drink. He didn't want to, though. The doctors saw him, but they said there was nothing they could do. He and they both knew that he was sick, but he was not sick in his body. Ghazali, finally on the brink of death or madness, resolved that he had no choice. He had to give up his life as a theologian and philosopher and try to live as a mystic. He told the caliph, his employer, and all of his friends and colleagues that he's going on the Hajj to Mecca. But he didn't go to Mecca right away. Instead, he was going to Damascus to try and live the life of the mystic. He lived in the kind of solitary confinement at the Great Mosque of Damascus, where for 2 years, Ghazali focused on prayer and fasting alone. He would climb the minaret there, locking the door behind him, spending his days by himself and above the reach of the world. Then he traveled to Jerusalem, where he similarly secluded himself near the Dome of the Rock. After this, he did make the Hajj and continued wandering around the Middle East. At some point, perhaps slowly, Ghazali realized that it wasn't the theologians or the philosophers who understood reality. It was the mystics. During my successive periods of meditation, there were revealed to me things impossible to recount. All that I shall say for the edification of the reader is this. I learned from a sure source that the mystics are the true pioneers on the path of God. There is nothing more beautiful than their life, nor more praiseworthy than their rule of conduct, nor purer than their morality. The intelligence of thinkers, the wisdom of philosophers, the knowledge of the most learned doctors of the law would in vain combine their efforts in order to modify or improve their doctrines and morals. It would be impossible. After 12 years of traveling quietly from place to place and living under severe prayer and meditation, Ghazali returned to Tus, his hometown. He took up teaching again at the Nizamiya in Nishapur, but only for about 4 years. And then he retired, went back to his homeland, and seems to have died peacefully in the year 1111. Ghazali appeared on the stage of history at a very unique moment. On the one hand, Islamic theology, and especially Ash'arite theology, called into question how far human reason could go. On the other hand, the philosophers were making leaps into scientific development which would go unrivaled until the modern world. Sunnism was now a standard aspect of Islamic identity for those who didn't consider themselves Shiites. The Abbasid world was reforming around the power of the Seljuk sultans, and even more contact was being made with the peoples of Africa, East Asia, and South Asia. In a world where all this knowledge, all these opinions, and all these people were starting to collide and mix, the Nizamiya educational system is established with Ghazali steering the ship. And this is why Ghazali has come to have this strange sort of dual role in the history of Islam and human thought in general. He is at once a critic of nearly everyone. He analyzes each sect and worldview that he knows of very carefully, and then surgically strikes them back using their own assumptions and methods. He attacks theologians with their hypocrisy, philosophers with their irrationality. But on the flip side, Ghazali never really dismisses anyone wholesale. In the end, Ghazali is actually something of a unifier. Sure, he rips all these different schools apart, but then he kind of sews them back together with a new vision for Islamic thought. He shows how each method of searching for the truth is limited, but also how each is useful. He lays out how he's going to dissect and then reunite all of Islamic thought in two major projects. The first is the 40-volume ISUII013, the revival of the religious sciences. There, Ghazali tries to reconcile the observations of Kalam with the expertise of the mystics, covering all manners of subjects from the pillars of Islam to manners when eating to embracing spiritual poverty to preparing for the afterlife. This revival of the religious sciences would in time become one of the cornerstones of Sunni education, as it remains to this day. Regarding the role of philosophy, Ghazali wrote two books that today function as a set. The first is The Aims of the Philosophers, the Maqasid al-Falasifa, where Ghazali lays out the methods of rationality and logic and how these overlap or don't with the concerns of Islam. Basically, it's an intro to philosophy book. The second is the Tahafut al-Falasifa, the Incoherence of the Philosophers. In the Incoherence, Ghazali argues where the philosophers like al-Farabi have gone too far and contradicted themselves. Ghazali uses logic to expose the weak points in logic. In both of these books, though, Ghazali argues that the material sciences that Falsafa engages in, like mathematics, physics, and chemistry, are good, useful, and virtuous. But when philosophers come to the supernatural, things that by their very nature exist beyond reason, like God or the miraculous, the philosophers are out of their depth. In short, Ghazali presents an argument for what is later called occasionalism. It's a discussion of how cause and effect work. In short, Ghazali says that while you can argue that a certain cause and a certain effect always happen together, you can't actually observe causation itself. All you can observe is the occasion for a certain cause and a certain effect. Let's take two examples of this, both of which Ghazali uses in The Incoherence of the Philosophers. The first is cotton burning when it touches fire. Unless there's some outside force controlling the cotton or the fire, when cotton touches fire, the cotton will burn. Always the occasion of cotton touching fire leads to burning. And yet, you don't see the cause of this effect itself. We never see cause itself. What we see are the habits of the universe. Things tend to work the way they do, and so we assume that they'll work the same way in the future. Another example that Ghazali mentions is whether God can turn books into horses. The ISUII theologian must claim, yes, God can do anything, whether we understand how or not. The philosopher must claim, no, that's impossible because we have no evidence of the physical world ever working that way. But Ghazali sides with the ISUIItes here. Just because we've never observed a causal relationship between books and horses, that doesn't mean it's impossible. However, since we have repeatedly observed that books don't turn into horses, we can also conclude that the possibility of this happening is negligible. That is, it's not that it can't happen, but rather that it seems that this is not the way the universe or God tends to work. It's like God has habits. God tends to do things in a certain way, though God can violate a habit if God wants to. By thinking this way, the tensions between philosophy, theology, and mysticism were resolved. The philosophers were right that the world works in a regular, predictable way, and therefore, their logic and material sciences do in fact work. You never see God turn books into horses, and it's pretty wise to assume that that doesn't happen. But the theologians are right that reason has its limits, as reason can only detect regularity, not exceptions to rules. So God could turn books into horses, and if that were to happen, it would be entirely unpredictable to the reason. And the mystics are right, because they're the ones who actually have Burhan. They're the only ones who have first-hand experiences of the things they're actually talking about. So Ghazali brings all of these different sciences together, and they never really went their separate ways again. As long as every kind of Islamic knowledge stays in its lane, they can work in harmony for the betterment of society and the soul. Who were the Seljuks? What is a sultan, a vizier, and the ulama, singular alim? Describe the life of al-Ghazali. What is the Nizamiya? Describe some of the arguments of al-Ghazali and some of his major works. What is occasionalism?